She glances at her watch before she begins. She doesn't know she does it. That's the point. The gesture is so embedded, so automatic, so thoroughly woven into the operating system of who she is that it has long since dropped below the level of conscious choice. Wrist up, eyes down, wrist back. A reflex as natural as breathing, and about as examined. The watch says 8:47. She registers this the way you register a word you've read so many times it has stopped meaning anything. Then she looks up, and she looks directly at you, and she begins. She doesn't ease in. She never has. I have spent my entire life watching the time. I never once asked what I was saving it for. She lets that sit. She is 50 years old, this woman. Silver-haired and sharp-eyed, composed in the particular way that 3 decades of high-stakes professionalism produces, a composure that is not peace, that has never been peace, but that wears the same face. Behind her, half in shadow, a clock. On her wrist, another one. She is bracketed by time the way she has always been bracketed by time, and the irony is not lost on her, and she is past the age of pretending things aren't what they are. She tells you, without ceremony, what she built. The degrees. The titles. The house that photographed beautifully and hummed with the specific silence of a place where everyone is well provided for and no one is entirely seen. She recites the achievements the way you'd read a receipt, accurately, without warmth, checking items off a list that seemed, at the time of each acquisition, to be building towards something. She got everything she went after. She wants you to understand that clearly before she tells you what it cost. Because the cost is the story. The cost is why she is sitting in front of you instead of behind another deadline, another calendar, another version of the wall she spent 30 years constructing and calling a foundation. She is not here to perform her pain. She is not here for your sympathy. She is here because she is already on the other side of the finish line you are currently sprinting toward, and the look on her face, measured, unflinching, carrying something that has not yet decided whether it is grief or wisdom or both, is information you can use if you are willing to receive it. She glances at her watch one more time. Catches herself. Sets her wrist down on the table with the quiet deliberateness of a woman practicing something new. She looks back at you. I did everything right, she says. I was never present for any of it. And by the time I understood the difference, by the time I finally looked up from the clock long enough to see my own life, I was 50 years old and the years were behind me. She pauses. Let me tell you what I found when I got there. She was 19 the first time she understood what invisibility looked like on a person's face. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no cruelty you could point to and name. It happened in a beige room with fluorescent lighting and a metal folding table, at a parent-teacher conference in the autumn of 1993. Gloria sat beside her mother, Margaret, a woman who had sewn Halloween costumes by hand, who knew every teacher's name, who had shown up to every single thing, and watched a man in a corduroy blazer speak directly past her as though she were a coat rack. He had asked, almost as an afterthought, what Margaret did. Her mother had smiled the way women like her smiled, openly, without apology, and said she raised her children. The man nodded the way people nod when they've stopped listening. He turned back to his papers. The meeting moved on. Margaret didn't flinch. That was the part that stayed with Gloria. Her mother had clearly learned, somewhere along the way, to receive that particular kind of dismissal without reaction, to absorb it quietly, the way you absorb rain. She had practice. And watching her mother sit in that plastic chair with her hands folded and her dignity perfectly intact and completely unacknowledged, Gloria felt something calcify inside her chest. She didn't have a word for it then. She just knew she would never sit in that chair. Not that chair specifically. The chair of being overlooked. The chair of mattering only in rooms where no one who counted was keeping score. She loved her mother fiercely, completely, and that love was entirely compatible with the vow she made on the drive home, staring out the passenger window at the dark Ohio streets. I will make myself impossible to ignore. She kept that vow. For 30 years, she kept it so well she forgot it was a vow and started believing it was simply who she was. But vows made at 19 are not made from wisdom. They are made from wounds. And the thing about building a life on top of a wound is that the structure can become magnificent, genuinely, impressively magnificent, while the wound underneath stays exactly the same size it was the night you decided you'd never let anyone make you feel that small. Gloria didn't know that yet. At 19, sitting in the passenger seat of her mother's Buick, she only knew the shape of what she didn't want. She didn't know that running from something is not the same as running towards something. She didn't know that the woman she was so determined not to become was, in every way that actually mattered, the most present person in her life. She would spend the next 3 decades finding that out the hard way. The clock was already running. She just hadn't learned yet to ask what it was counting down to. The acceptance letter from Ohio State arrived on a Tuesday, and Gloria read it standing at the kitchen counter before her mother was awake. She didn't celebrate. She filed it. That was the first sign, though she wouldn't have called it that then. She had simply learned, somewhere in the architecture of her ambition, that feeling things took time she didn't have. There were applications to submit, scholarships to chase, a future to construct with both hands before anyone could tell her it wasn't hers to build. Celebration was for people who were finished. Gloria was never finished. College came and went in a blur of early mornings and highlighted textbooks and a GPA she maintained the way a surgeon maintains a sterile field, with total, humorless precision. Then graduate school. Then the first job, which led to the better job, which revealed the job above that. Each credential landed in her resume like a brick, and she told herself she was building a foundation. It felt like a foundation. It had the weight of one. What she was actually building, she would only understand much later, was a wall. She met Daniel in her second year of graduate school. He was warm where she was precise, unhurried where she was relentless, the kind of man who could sit in a Sunday afternoon without needing it to produce anything. She loved that about him. She also, quietly, didn't trust it. They married at 26 in a ceremony she half-planned from a spreadsheet, and Daniel laughed about it in his toast, and everyone found it charming, and Gloria smiled and told herself that efficiency was just another form of love. For a while, it worked. Or it worked well enough that neither of them examined it too closely. But somewhere in the 3rd year of marriage, their life together began to run on a kind of parallel scheduling logic, 2 people sharing a home the way professionals share a conference room. Cordial. Organized. Occasionally warm. Daniel would suggest a weekend away and Gloria would pull up her calendar with the focused expression of someone solving a problem, and a date would be selected 3 months out, and then quietly moved, and then quietly dropped. He stopped suggesting with the same frequency. She didn't notice the frequency had changed. She was promoted twice before she turned 31. Each time, she called her mother first. Margaret always said the same thing, "I'm so proud of you, baby," in a voice so full and uncomplicated that Gloria would feel, for exactly a moment, the particular ache of being loved in a way she didn't know how to receive. Then she would hang up, open her laptop, and get back to work. The bricks kept coming. The wall kept rising. And Daniel, patient and quieter now, learned to build his life in the rooms she left unoccupied. Maya was born on a Thursday in March, and Gloria was back at her desk the following Monday. Not because she had to be. Because she didn't know how to be anywhere else. She told herself the story that ambitious mothers have always told themselves, the necessary story, the one that makes the alarm clock at 5:30 feel like an act of love rather than an act of avoidance. That the hours were for Maya. That the title was for Maya. That every early morning and late evening and missed bedtime was a brick in the foundation of a life her daughter would one day inherit and be grateful for. It was not an entirely false story. The house was good. The schools were excellent. There was always enough, more than enough, of everything that could be measured and provided and pointed to as evidence of devotion. What couldn't be measured was harder to account for. Daniel had taken a position with more flexibility by then, a quiet recalibration neither of them discussed directly, the way long-married people make significant decisions through implication and adjustment rather than conversation. He was there for the school pickups, the skinned knees, the Thursday night homework battles. He knew which stuffed animal Maya couldn't sleep without and which brand of mac and cheese she would eat and which she would push to the edge of the plate in silent protest. He knew the texture of her days. Gloria knew her daughter's schedule. She knew her pediatrician's name and her teacher's name and her best friend's mother's name. She had the information organized the way she had always organized important things, accessibly, efficiently, at a slight remove from the living of it. She told herself this was division of labor. She told herself Daniel was better at the soft things, the daily things, and that her job was to make sure the whole structure held. And the structure did hold. Nobody could argue that it didn't hold. But a structure and a home are not the same thing, and Gloria would not understand the difference for another decade. The moment she almost understood it came on an ordinary Wednesday evening. She had promised to be home for dinner at 7. A call ran long. Then another. She pulled into the driveway at 9:15 to find the kitchen clean, the leftovers covered in the refrigerator with a post-it note in Daniel's handwriting, and Maya's bedroom light already off. She stood in the hallway outside her daughter's door for a long moment. She could hear the slow, settled breathing of a child who had simply stopped waiting. She didn't open the door. She told herself Maya needed her sleep. She went downstairs, ate the leftovers standing at the counter, and checked her email. The post-it note said, "We saved you a plate." She threw it away. She would spend years throwing away the evidence of what she was missing. The morning it happened, she wasn't looking for anything. That was the thing about it, there was no dramatic precipice, no crisis gathering at the edges of the day. It was an ordinary Tuesday in November, the kind of morning that arrives gray and unhurried, and by some accident of scheduling there was a gap between 6:15 and 7:30 with nothing in it. No call. No deadline pressing from behind. Just light coming through the bathroom window at an angle she didn't recognize because she was never usually standing still long enough to notice the light. She had just stepped out of the shower. The mirror was fogged at the edges and clear in the center, and Gloria stood in front of it the way she always stood in front of mirrors, efficiently, functionally, as a brief operational checkpoint before the day began. She reached for her moisturizer. And then she stopped. She didn't know, afterward, what made her actually look. But she did. She looked at herself the way you look at someone you haven't seen in years, searching first for recognition, finding it slowly, and then finding something else underneath it. The face looking back was hers. Competent, composed, still handsome in the architectural way that certain kinds of discipline produce. But the eyes. She stayed with the eyes for longer than she had looked at herself in perhaps a decade. They were exhausted in a way that sleep didn't touch. Not tired, she knew tired, she had managed tired for 30 years with reasonable efficiency. This was something older and quieter. A kind of depletion that lived below the operational layer, in some deeper register she had been too busy to visit. She looked like a woman who had been running so long she had forgotten what she was running toward, but had kept going because stopping felt more dangerous than the running. She recognized the expression. It was the expression her mother had worn in that beige room with the fluorescent lights. The careful composure. The contained dignity. The look of a person who has learned to absorb what they cannot change. She stood there for a long time. That afternoon, she did something she had not done in 11 years. She opened a browser tab that had nothing to do with work and searched for a hotel in Portugal she had seen in a magazine in a waiting room, once, years ago, and never forgotten. She found it. She booked a week in March, for herself and Daniel, the way they had always said they would travel when things settled down. She told Daniel that evening. He looked at her carefully, the way he had learned to look when something shifted in her, and said simply, "I'll believe it when we're on the plane." She cancelled it 2 weeks later. A conflict had emerged. An opportunity she couldn't afford to miss. She told herself there would be another March. There always was. That was the lie she was best at. Maya was 26 when she gave the toast, which meant Gloria had been her mother for exactly as long as she had been running from her own. She noticed that math only later, on the drive home. The restaurant Daniel had chosen was warm and candlelit and full of the people Gloria had collected over 30 years of professional and social navigation, colleagues who respected her, neighbors who admired her, a few friends close enough to know her schedule but not close enough to know much beyond it. 50 people, perhaps. The right 50. The flowers were exactly right. The wine was exactly right. Gloria sat at the head of the table in the burgundy dress she had bought for the occasion and felt, for most of the evening, the particular satisfaction of a well-executed event. Then Maya stood up. She was beautiful, Gloria's daughter. She had Daniel's warmth and some quality of her own, a groundedness, an ease in her own skin, that Gloria had always observed with a mix of pride and something she couldn't quite name. Maya tapped her glass, smiled at the room, and began. The toast was good. That was the cruelest part of it, it was genuinely good. Maya was articulate and funny, and she held the room with a natural grace that made people lean in. She said her mother was the hardest working person she had ever known. She said Gloria had taught her that showing up mattered, that discipline was a form of love. She told a story about Gloria driving her to a swim meet at 5 in the morning and waiting in the cold without complaint. The room laughed warmly. Daniel smiled. Gloria smiled. And somewhere underneath the smile, in that quiet interior space she visited so rarely, something registered. The toast was full of admiration. It was warm and considered and carefully meant. But it was the kind of toast you give for someone you have watched from a respectful distance, someone you have observed rather than known, catalogued rather than confided in. There was not a single moment in it that was private. Not one memory that belonged only to the two of them. Nothing that could only have been said by Maya about Gloria, because of something that had passed between them in the particular way things pass between a mother and a daughter who have genuinely found each other. It was the toast of a good daughter for a mother she admired. It was not the toast of a daughter who knew her mother's heart. Gloria held her smile for the photographer. She held it through the cake and the embraces and the warm, wine-flushed goodbyes. She held it until she and Daniel were in the car and the restaurant lights had disappeared in the rearview mirror, and then she set it down. Daniel didn't ask. He had learned, over 20 years, to read her silences. He drove. She watched the dark road unspool ahead of them. She didn't cry. She wasn't built for crying in cars. She just sat with the weight of what she had understood, turning it over slowly, the way you turn over something heavy when you finally stop pretending it isn't there. Her daughter had stood in a room full of people and described a woman Gloria recognized completely. And felt, for the first time, the full cost of being that woman. She started noticing them the way you notice a sound you can't identify, gradually, then all at once. Women she had known for years. Colleagues who had stepped back from senior roles in their 40s, neighbors who had chosen slower careers, friends of friends she had privately, reflexively categorized as women who hadn't pushed hard enough. She had never been unkind about it. She was too disciplined for unkindness. But the judgment had been there, organized neatly in the background of her assumptions the way all unexamined beliefs are organized, quietly, efficiently, completely out of sight. After the birthday dinner, she began to see them differently. There was Caroline, who had left a director position 12 years ago to consult part-time and raise her sons in a house that always seemed, when Gloria drove past it, to have people in the yard. Gloria had noted Caroline's departure from the corporate track at the time with a private mixture of sympathy and superiority. Sympathy because the ambition was clearly there. Superiority because the follow-through, Gloria had decided, was not. She saw Caroline at a neighborhood gathering 6 weeks after the birthday dinner and watched her for longer than was probably polite, the way she stood, loose-shouldered and unhurried, laughing at something her husband said with the uncalculated ease of a person who was not, in that moment, anywhere else. Gloria was always somewhere else. Even when she was standing still. There was her colleague Ruth, who had turned down a vice presidency at 52 and retired early to a small town in Vermont where she apparently gardened and read and walked every morning without a destination. Gloria had received the news of Ruth's retirement with genuine bewilderment. All that capability, she had thought. All that accumulated expertise, handed back. She had sent a polite card and privately considered it a kind of surrender. She pulled up Ruth's email address twice after the birthday dinner. Both times she closed it without writing anything. She wasn't sure what she wanted to ask. She wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. What unsettled her, what she sat with in the odd quiet hours that were multiplying in her life now, appearing in the gaps she didn't know how to fill, was not that these women seemed happy in some simple or uncomplicated way. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was something more specific than happiness. They seemed located. Present inside their own lives in a way that Gloria, standing in the middle of everything she had built, could not honestly claim to be. She had spent 30 years becoming impressive. She was not sure she had spent 30 minutes becoming known. The comparison trap, she was beginning to understand, had always run in both directions. She had compared herself upward for decades, measuring her achievements against the next level. She had never once considered that the women she had looked down on might have found something she hadn't thought to look for. She didn't understand it yet. But for the first time in 30 years, she wanted to. She had owned 17 watches. She knew this because she counted them one Sunday afternoon in January, standing at her dresser with the velvet tray in her hands and nowhere particular to be, a condition she still found faintly alarming. 17 watches across 30 years. Different bands, different faces, different weights on the wrist. She had upgraded with each promotion, the way certain people mark milestones with jewelry and others mark them with wine. For Gloria, it had always been watches. Precision instruments. Objects whose entire purpose was to tell you exactly where you stood in relation to the time you had left. She set the tray down and sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about her relationship with time and realized, with the slow clarity that had been arriving in pieces since the birthday dinner, that she had never had one. Not really. What she'd had was a war. A 30-year campaign to outpace, outmaneuver, and outlast a current that had been moving at exactly the same speed her entire life, indifferent to her effort, unimpressed by her credentials, utterly unmoved by her will. She had treated time as an opponent. Something to be beaten into submission by early mornings and packed schedules and the ruthless elimination of anything that couldn't justify its presence on a calendar. She had spoken about time the way generals speak about territory, ground to be taken, held, defended. She had saved time, managed time, bought time, complained about the lack of it. She had done everything with time except the one thing that might have mattered. She had never simply been inside it. She tried to remember the last occasion she had been somewhere, truly somewhere, not mentally orbiting the next thing, and found she had to go back further than was comfortable. A morning in her 20s, perhaps, sitting on a fire escape in Columbus with bad coffee and nowhere to be. Before the first job. Before the wall got high enough to block the light. There had been a quality to that morning she had never successfully reproduced and had eventually stopped trying to reproduce, filing it under the category of things that belonged to youth and could not be reclaimed by adults with responsibilities. But sitting now on the edge of her bed in January, she wondered if she had filed it in the wrong category entirely. The current had always been there. Moving at its own pace, in its own direction, without asking her permission. Every woman she had watched since the birthday dinner, Caroline loose-shouldered in the yard, Ruth somewhere in Vermont with her hands in the earth, they had not stopped the current. They had simply, at some point, stopped fighting it. They had let it carry them somewhere instead of exhausting themselves holding position. Gloria looked at the watches on the velvet tray. 17 ways of measuring something she had never once allowed herself to feel. She wondered, for the first time, what it would be like to take one off and leave it on the dresser. To walk into a morning without a wrist that was always counting. She didn't do it. Not yet. But she left the question where she could find it. She called Maya on a Thursday with no occasion for it. No birthday, no holiday, no logistical reason requiring coordination. Just a Thursday in February with gray light at the window and the phone in her hand and the particular courage it takes to do a simple thing you have made complicated by years of not doing it. Maya picked up on the third ring, and there was a beat, brief, almost imperceptible, of surprised recalibration in her voice before she settled into the call. Gloria heard it. She filed it not as a wound but as information. Accurate, fair, earned. They talked for 22 minutes. About nothing significant. About a book Maya was reading and a restaurant she had tried and a small story about her commute that was funny in an ordinary way. Gloria sat at the kitchen table and listened with both hands around a coffee mug and did not once check her email. When she hung up she sat quietly for a moment with the residue of the conversation, the specific warmth of it, and understood that 22 minutes of nothing significant was the most important call she had made in years. She did it again the following Thursday. And the one after that. With Daniel it was slower and more complicated, the way repair always is between two people who have been careful with each other for a long time. There was no single conversation, no declared reckoning. There were instead a series of small surrenders, Gloria arriving home at 6 instead of 8 without announcement, Daniel looking up from his book with the same careful expression he had worn for years, the one that had learned not to hope too specifically. She started asking him questions she already knew the answers to, just to hear him talk. She started answering his questions honestly instead of efficiently. One evening in March she sat beside him on the couch without her laptop and they watched something forgettable on television and she let the evening be exactly what it was, unremarkable and warm, and did not once try to make it productive. He reached over at some point and held her hand. She let him. The work on herself was the hardest and the quietest. There were no milestones she could record, no credentials that arrived in the mail to confirm progress. She began to notice, with the unflinching honesty that had always been her sharpest tool, how automatically she reached for busyness the moment stillness arrived, how quickly she could generate a task, a purpose, an item requiring immediate attention whenever the present moment asked too much of her. She started, slowly and without drama, choosing not to reach. Sitting with the discomfort of an unscheduled hour. Letting a Sunday be a Sunday. It was not cinematic. There was no music, no montage, no moment of clean transformation she could point to later and say, there, that was when everything changed. It was just a woman, showing up. Imperfectly, consistently, later than she would have chosen. Showing up anyway. She still checks the time. Old habits don't dissolve, they thin, gradually, like fog burning off a morning you decided to walk into anyway. But something has changed in the checking. There is a beat now, small and new, between the glance at her wrist and whatever comes next. A fraction of a second in which she is aware of the gesture, aware that she is doing it, aware of why, aware that the awareness itself is a kind of freedom she didn't have before. It is not a dramatic transformation. It is a woman, standing in her own life with her eyes open, which turns out to be harder and more significant than anything she accomplished with them half closed. She thinks about the title sometimes. The thing she would tell her younger self, if the distance between them could be crossed. By the time I realized this at 50, it was too late. She chose those words carefully, because they are true, and because truth, delivered without softening, is the only thing that ever actually reached her. It was too late for certain things. The years of Maya's childhood that ran on routine instead of presence. The evenings Daniel stopped asking. The friendships she let thin to nothing because she couldn't justify the time. Those are not recoverable. She has made her peace with that, slowly, imperfectly, the way you make peace with anything real. But here is what she also knows, and what she wants to hand across whatever distance exists between her story and yours. Too late is not a life sentence. It is a location. And the moment you know where you are, you can begin to move. She is not standing here as a cautionary tale that ends in wreckage. She is standing here as a woman who woke up at 50, which is not the beginning she would have chosen and is still, unambiguously, a beginning. Maya calls on Thursdays now. Daniel held her hand through a forgettable Tuesday evening last week and she let herself feel the full, uncomplicated weight of it. She walked outside this morning without a destination and came home 40 minutes later with muddy shoes and nothing to show for it and felt, in a way she cannot fully articulate, like herself. She is learning that the self was always there. Waiting with remarkable patience underneath everything she stacked on top of it. So if you are reading this from the middle of the race, if you recognize the packed calendar and the hollow promotions and the post-it notes you throw away without reading, she is not here to frighten you. She is here because she wishes someone had sat across from her at 35 and told her the truth without blinking. The clock is running. It was always running. That part doesn't change. But you are not behind. You are exactly where the rest of your life begins. Decide that now is when it starts. Then put down the watch. And begin.